Marshes for untold millennia, the Amaru race presided as the unrivaled sovereigns of the galaxy. Our ancestors had risen to dominance through a combination of technological superiority, military conquest, and the subjugation of less developed species that dared venture into the cosmic realms we claimed as our divine birthright. When fledgling civilizations achieved the capabilities for interstellar travel and expansion, they were presented with an uncompromising decree: renounce their upstart ambitions for independence and pledge their entire race into indentured servitude to the glorious Amaru, or be shown the full merciless might of our advanced arsenal and eradicated from existence without a shred of mercy. Many foolish, newly emergent spacefaring societies arrogantly rebuffed our magnanimous offer in the naive belief that they could retain their petty self-governance. They engaged in futile, defiant resistance against our overwhelmingly superior military forces, only to ultimately accept their defenselessness and capitulate to avoid outright extinction. The historical records detail extensive conflicts and protracted campaigns, as our imperial armadas systematically crushed such ill-conceived uprisings across the cosmos. But inevitably, all came to revere and embrace their new lives as productive, valued members of our vast, subjugated commonwealth of client races, and their homeworlds were integrated into our celestial domains. While stripped of their sovereignties, the indentured servant populaces were by no means subjected to draconian cruelties or viewed as expendable chattel slaves under Amaru governance. They were properly sustained with ample resources and provisions to maintain healthy, comfortable lifestyles. Their inherent rights to exist and propagate their species were protected, granting them respectable freedoms to preserve their cultural identities, beliefs, and societal principles, provided they posed no treasonous threats or seditious uprisings against the Empire's authority. We granted them substantial self-governing autonomies on their homeworlds and colonial territories, turning a pragmatic blind eye to overseeing their routine activities so long as all governing hierarchies and legislative policies remained subservient and did not violate the sacrosanct tenets of Amaru law and ideological doctrine that reigned supreme. Constabulary enforcer legions stood ever vigilant to swiftly quash any hint of rebellious tendencies or civil unrest that dared defy the imperial may. For the servant races, life under Amaru subjugation may have diminished their ambitions and national prides, but it afforded them protections, prosperous existences, and a stable enforced order they likely could never have achieved had they continued along their feeble primitive civilizations while squabbling in their insular territorial conflicts. And we, the Amaru, reaped the obligations of conquered worlds, providing commercial resources, a vast pool of labor forces, auxiliary military conscripts, and a self-sustaining interdependent network to propel our empire's glories to ever greater elevations of supremacy throughout the galaxy's explored territories and beyond its farthest unexplored realms. Our unchallenged reign as the cosmos's unrivaled sovereigns appeared an eternal certainty destined to propel our dynasty to escalating zeniths of grandeur with each passing year. That was until they arrived. The humans, the deluded denizens of the unremarkable rock they called Earth or Terra, oblivious to the breadth of our magnificence and accomplishments. We approached with ambassadorial overtures to welcome this newly emergent spacefaring race into the embrace of our benevolent dominion, apprising them of all the privileges and amazing achievements our civilization had to offer. Yet instead of expressing gratitude at being granted the honor of enrolling as the latest serviceable members of our imperial family, their envoys recoiled in horror and disdain at the subjugation we presented. Their lead ambassador uttered what we assumed was an honorific of reverence in her native tongue, but the hateful sneer across her countenance, while vocalizing it strongly implied the exact opposite derogatory connotation meant to convey utter disdain and rebuke of our societal principles and authority. The human emissary made a hasty departure without affording us clarifying dialogue. Hastily returning to the territorial boundaries her species had only recently expanded into via rudimentary sleeper ships over generations of tedious interstellar voyages. Once regrouped with the humans' governing leadership, we received a final cursory transmission explicitly stating, "We will never join you in blunt rhetoric," to convey their defiance of our generous overtures. They subsequently instituted policies aimed at sealing off their newly colonized star systems from any potential Amaru influences, establishing uncompromising territorial interdiction zones that our ships and emissaries were barred from violating, lest we instigate open hostile engagements. and warfare for which their militarily feeble forces stood virtually no chances against our multitudes of battle-hardened imperial armadas and advanced weaponry. The ruling Amaru elite merely scoffed at the humans' obstinance and misguided sense of fortitude against inevitably being subsumed into our empire's greatness. For epochs, we had encountered such transitory pockets of resistance from lesser species before they ultimately came to recognize our benevolent purpose and embraced the privileged blessings of enrollment as treasured members of our collective domains once forceful occupations of their territories achieved. This human defiance, we reasoned, was but a temporary insular detour that would run its futile course once they were made to accept their overmatched inferiority or willfully extinguish themselves from the vast cosmic chapters destiny had reserved for our supremacy's ongoing chronicle. Indeed, in the initial cycles following their territorial separations, isolated human colonial scout vessels did begin emerging hesitantly from behind their enforced territorial borders in what we assumed were exploratory probes evaluating the merits and bounties of potential allegiance with our celestial commonwealth. Some scouts appeared to harbor commercial designs as freelancers seeking any lucrative trade opportunities that could be exploited for profits. While clearly lacking in deference and discipline for our empire's grandeur, we chose to permit such feeble voyages to blithely transit our territories, unimpeded in the hopes their crews disseminated profound witnessings of Amaru prosperities and accomplishments that their homeworld's civic leadership might gain elucidation, or calculated expectation being their governing bodies, could be brought around to solicitous entreaties for acceptance as legal inductees into our subjugated realms by dispatched human ambassadors wising up to our boundless benevolence. Or, at the very least, the human scouts' tradecraft dealings and relatively pacified presences could perhaps help foster an eventual paradigm of fruitful coexistent circumstances until their impetuous isolationist conceits withered on the immutable truth of our supremacy's immortal inevitability. We were in no rush dispositions to overtly demand their fealties, subtly preferring the steady dispensation of exposure to all our greatnesses as a gentler coaxing tactic history had demonstrated often achieved the eventuality of fawning solicitations for induction. So we observed this ebbing up swell of independent human scout vessels operating throughout our territories over the ensuing epochs with detached dismissals for their relevance. Mistakenly in hindsight, what our arrogantly dismissive attitudes utterly failed to heed or foresee was that the humans were in no way cowed or awe-struck by our societal strengths and convictions, or that any outward emulation of obedience was but a mask for an elaborately orchestrated coalescing of seditious intent against the Amaru Empire's solidified hegemony playing out over the course of generations as the humans' navigational charts and tradecraft operations expanded discreetly well beyond our territorial peripheries. The insolent human scouts we granted leniencies for unfettered operations steadily seeded the insidious pathologies of independence and anti-Amaru revolts amongst the more disaffected elements of our indentured servant populaces laboring on outlying colonial world. What the delusional human species perceived in our enlightened societal frameworks was not an equitable, stable, and prosperous galactic design to unify and provide for the bountiful continuation of all cultivated sentient races under one harmonious accord without conflict or shortages, but rather an oppressive, repressive, archaic, and arrogantly unjustifiable impediment upon their petty individualist ideologies in quest for cosmic self-determination. The more their scout ships and concealed expatriate malcontent operatives encountered those servant race factions, most disillusioned and susceptible to anti-Amaru insurrectionist sentiments amongst our subjugated commonwealth, the more successfully they spread the virulence of revolutionary sedition and propagandized the humans as enlightened harbingers against oppression who could motivate and assist any liberation uprisings that sought to shatter our empire's holdings across the galaxy. Foolish malcontents, unable to appreciate the providential bounties their indentured lifestyles afforded compared to the barbaric anarchy awaiting in any rebelliously severed autonomies. Over multiple generations, this clandestine cultivation of interstellar insurgency steadily spread from remote fringe colony worlds deeper into the heart of our dominions, while we idly disregarded such incremental encroachments with condescending dismissals when isolated flare-ups of civil unrest were quelled by imperial enforcer garrisons expeditiously putting down deluded insurrectionists. We ignorantly allowed ourselves the reassurance that these were mere sporadic upheavals that could be efficiently nullified. Grave miscalculation of the scope. This cancer of human-inspired defiance had metastasized across our realms. Finally, it erupted in a cascading cataclysm of coordinated simultaneous uprisings, spanning multiple territories where rebel militias swiftly overwhelmed imperial garrisons through tactical superiorities while disrupting supply lines and communications, all issuing from the viral human interpolated ideologies of liberty and self-governance that had taken root over generations inside our very holdings. Within solar cycles, swaths of colonial dominions were plunged into protracted civil wars as emboldened seditionists secured continual human provisions of armaments and strategic advisors compounding their incremental gains. Once worlds regarded as dutiful, productive members of our subjugated providence were now erupting with open revolts as ideological malignancies spread from human-backed revolutionary cadres or in futile reactionary damage control efforts. Innumerable servant populaces, deemed compromised or providing safe havens for human collaborators, suffered merciless fire sweeps and outright extinction-level orbital bombardments at our hands in vain bids to enforce obeisance and re-establish order, all only serving to pour further accelerant across the escalating conflagration. By the time the reigning Amaru hierarchs managed to comprehend the existential enormity posed by this human-orchestrated insurrection and realigned our armadas in depleted reactionary countermeasures, it was far too late to reverse the tsunami of sown unrest. The humans had masterminded their dissemination of anti-Amaru sentiments to foment a galaxy-wide uprising with a meticulous precision and patience spanning generations. Their provocateurs seamlessly sowed the virulent seeds of independence and rebellion amongst the most receptive populations within our very commonwealth for epochs, before supplying the final tactical elements and strategic coordination that allowed emboldened militias to blossom in every with their segregated uprisings appearing in unison as part of an intricately calculated, synchronized offensive. Mighty armadas that had effortlessly enforced unconditional compliance across the cosmos were routed or blasted from the heavens when redeployed to combat nexuses where insurrectionist forces were dug in deeply amongst populaces inflamed with revolutionary fervor. Impregnable fortresses and strongholds were overrun. Colonial capitals fell unrepentantly to adversaries, wielding zeal eclipsing our oppressive brutalities. Within a decade, upwards of 90% of territorially subjugated domains, once considered secured cornerstones, had slipped irretrievably beyond the Amaru Empire's destabilized grip in a cascading anti-colonial reckoning sparked by human zeal and relentless patience. Where once existed pacified protectorate worlds economically bound to uphold our sovereignty, arose disunited revolutionary republics, emboldened to declare independence with human-supplied arms, and the rallying inspiration as their meddling ideologies spread. Worlds where dutiful hierarchs of every imaginable phenotype had unflinchingly executed the imperial dictates were rising defiantly against us. Whether compelled by greed for autonomy or spiteful opportunisms to settle socio-cultural grievances while eliminating their overseers, newly minted rebel states arose with their own diverse martial forces supplemented by detached human military advisors overseeing the final purgings of Amaru occupation. Anywhere Amaru occupations and colonial garrisons had existed soon bore witness to horrific genocides of our populations through butcheries, exiles into cosmic abysses aboard feeble craft, or even mass sterilizations to permanently sever future claims or allegiance to those domains. As more upheavals spilled across interstellar regions, we increasingly found our armadas outmatched by multifarious coordinated rebel fronts, whom perpetually feinted strikes before blitzing any redeployments with escapable encirclements and deathly barrages. Wherever the greatest fortified convents of indoctrinated imperial servitors were positioned, humanity ensured rebel uprisings erupted across those installations' orbital peripheries and supporting provisions relays, in effect decapitating and starving out any final holdouts, while their conclaves were perpetually bombarded by indefensible pincer maneuvers. In beleaguered colony worlds where some semblance of stalwart Amaru military stability maintained footholds, those remaining formations awoke to escalating devastations as overhead orbital stations, communication relay satellites, and defensive platforms fell from the heavens in blazing wreckages caused by rebel hijackings. all transpiring too rapidly to mount sufficient reprisals or retreats before our garrisons found themselves overrun and outgunned by massed opposition encompassing interstellar attack corridors. Those scattered Amaru legions offering defiance past their overrun colonies' falls soon found themselves ambushed upon any attempted extrications, trapped and eradicated in distant warp space killing boxes by massed counter-deployments from rebel alliances across multiplanetic united fronts, and all precipitated by the same insidious human provocateurs whose divisive, interpolating presence so many generations earlier we had disregarded as a triviality of no enduring significance, now dominating each newly liberated colony world and orchestrating their galactic purge of the Amaru Dominion's influences through their embedded cadres and strategic advisors that had such indefensible deployments prearranged. The same treacherous species whose flagrant insolence we had so arrogantly dismissed as a temporary detour rather than the patient calculating metastasis it truly embodied. Within less than a century, a coordinated offensive of revolutionary magnitude had systematically purged our once unassailable sovereignty down to the ancestral Amaru homeworld itself, and a mere handful of heavily fortified core colony bastions beyond those few remaining readouts. Virtually every other domain where our reign had prospered endlessly across the cosmos had slipped from ironclad allegiance to be subsumed under revolutionary provisional authorities demanding atonement for our oppressions while embracing human populist edicts of self-determination and governance by meritorious consent. No other uprisings, civil wars, or contested severances from our authority throughout the Empire's dynastic epochs had ever approached the precipitous galactic implosion we found ourselves engulfing so thoroughly in wake of humanity's perfidiously catalyzed havoc. Countless expeditionary fleets dispatched to regain seized territories and re-establish obediences were obliterated piecemeal by the innumerable unified rebel armadas while in warp, leaving our fortified worlds cut off and surrounded as more and more frontier outposts blinked from our celestial charts in compounded losses of astral terrain. Planets that had formerly sworn eternal fealties as privileged imperial capital worlds were systematically reduced to smoldering macro graveyards of ruin under orbital bombardments or grotesque genocidal occupations. Incomprehensible as the losses seemed, the perpetual visuals of mayhem civilians shared across open data channels revealed deeper demoralizing devastations with each passing cycle. Once ultra-fortified battle stations glimpsed erupting in apocalyptic debris clouds from sabotaged internal detonations, streets of starships frantically burning warp trails from advancing armadas before their dissipated thruster signatures faded abruptly from termination under precision lance bombardments. Freshly constructed shipworm anchorages reduced to cratered dead zones, where only the blasted rib cages of hulls in progress remained. Origin colonies collapsing into civil wars between loyalists and human-inspired mutineers, while their churning furnace reactors detonated skywards like miniature suns searing the orphaned moon's surfaces. Despair grew endemic as each upstart revolutionary syndicate consolidated power and expelled our gubernatorial occupations through escalating barbarities beyond the civilized norms we had long afforded protected populations. Public displays of subjugated aristocrats and bureaucrats tormented or executed in rituals conjuring the most primal depravities. Even Amaru civilian families of indentured service providers found themselves falling prey as ethnic scapegoats for mobs inflamed by generations of sown dissension, finally granted bloody venting after the seditious embers had reached combustion. And in the smoldering backdrop of each grisly triumph broadcast across open combans by the various revolutionary cabals, the subliminal yet undeniable presence of their human ideological masters could be glimpsed or overheard string-pulling the puppet republics' affairs, no longer relegated to ambiguously skulking anonymities. The swaggering, interloping human coordinators and strategic advisors made undisguised spectacles of orchestrating every pivotal maneuver and transition of authority on the newly liberated worlds, their arrogant smirks of self-satisfaction barely concealed across projections from ceremonial upheavals where our forebears' monuments and iconographies were desecrated to cement each subjugated domain's severance from our eons-old sovereignty. With each passing cycle, more former Amaru holdings slipped into inaugurated realms of autonomy under human-facilitated revolutionary juntas and militias, until the breadth of territorial control still tenuously maintained around the ancestral throne world of Amaru Prime dwindled down to a relatively minuscule demesne, comprising a handful of our oldest, most fortified bastions and industrialized colony forgeable interstellar realms of commerce and war processing that had for ages sustained the prosperity and military primacy enabling our empire's perpetuated dominance, now severed and subsumed under human-imposed edicts of independence. The dawning realization that the unthinkable was occurring on a galactic scale prompted increasingly desperate bids to fortify and salvage what defensive capabilities remained across those few stalwart homeworld redoubts. Available reservists and wardens were mustered, and weaponries marshaled in a final coagulation of committed imperial forces, sworn to preserve our dynastic continuance at any cost, even in the face of such long odds against the encroaching revolutionary fervor. Yet no degree of enhanced security umbra, orbital battle station deployment, localized jamming of telecommunication data streams, or civilian conscription policies could stem the unstoppable ideological contagion that seeped through every enforcement regimen like a miasmic specter. For every Amaru hardliner raised in our traditionalist doctrines with vows to resist the upheaval to their last exhalations, there seemed to exist a proportionate number already turned by human interpolated principles of sedition and fomented insurgency, each pledged to undermine our last defense umbras at whatever opportunities presented themselves as impromptu rebel saboteurs, armories usurped from within, intelligence deliberately compromised to invite security vulnerabilities. Such was the intricately viral, self-perpetuating nature of the revolution that even within our own remaining fortresses, bristling for siege, human ideologies of independence had permeated every servant race contingent, military caste, menial labor corps, and civic populace, an unseen Cold War of belief systems calcifying entire subdivisions and demographics in diametric opposition, no matter the heightened enforcement protocols or privileged segregations implemented. Desperate for any solution towards reasserting even marginalized control, our hereditary ministries grudgingly began parlaying cultural and territorial concessions to the human emissaries overseeing the uprisings, perhaps fooling ourselves that more moderate compromises could be leveraged against their extremist revolutionary vanguards in these late negotiating gambits to stabilize some enduring Amaru governance, no matter how diluted from our former supremacies, anything to forestall the complete civilizational extinction that seemed our empire's unavoidable trajectory, unless drastic arrangements were swiftly brokered. If the terms demanded unilateral Amaru decolonization from all former subjugated territories and reinstituted sovereignties under human-facilitated administrations, it were far better to salvage a rump dynastic state around our few reconcentrated homeworld holdings and atmospheric terraforming facilities while abdicating broader interstellar hegemony than to endure the outright eradications of our species' legacy. But the revolutionary human coordinators recognized our crumbling predicament of desperation all too lucidly. They had every prior supplicant appealing for their temperances throughout history when facing inevitable existential demise. We were expeditiously rebuffed from any lenient treatment or considerations, echoing the same proclamations of finality that had for eons expelled our own entreaties for surrender. Revoke every ounce of your territory and military forces down to the space around your homeworld immediately. Relinquish all assets, resources, governments, and materiel for overseeing. Reduce your populations down to pre-interstellar levels through supervised population control programs. Dismantle all your spacefaring technological infrastructures and data repositories. Denounce any ancestral or newly revised versions of your subjugation philosophies. Disperse or execute every remaining upper echelon from your totalitarian hierarchies and ideological orders. Persevere on your homeworld as pre-industrial pastoral civilizations under permanent interdiction from further cosmic exploration and ambitions for rebirth. Do all this without considerations or conditions, and perhaps we shall permit your civilization's continuance under strict pragmatist observances in this single, permanently contained, an uncompromising, absolute, and categorical surrender of our entire cosmic inheritances that sent convulsions of horror even through the Amaru leadership ranks already resigned to relinquishing interstellar dominance for mere ancestral world survives. To accept the human provisional settlement negated virtually every principled virtue and crowning accomplishment of enlightenment, raised across 12,000 years of refined evolution beyond our primordial world bounds. We would become little more than a quarantined species of pinballs regressing into galactic irrelevancies, destined to lapse gradually across the cosmic ages into bestial self-destructive tribalism on a single dying world. No, if our reign and philosophies were to perish finally in the wake of such uncompromising revolutionary agendas imposed, then our remaining hereditary strategies chose to meet ultimate dissolution as befitting our lineage's unbowed ethos, rather than accept metaphysical castrations that amounted to self-immolations of our souls. We preferred whatever doomed defiance, ordained a more defiantly celebrated apocalypse on our own terms. Thus, the final refusals to capitulate left our race to brace across those few lingering homeworld strong points for the impending Allied Revolutionary Armada's obliteration campaigns, in absolution to refute surrendering our ancestral identities and existences, while earning the dignity of fighting unflinching to our very last before the human-facilitated revolutionaries perpetrated our extinction as a sovereign race. The massing dreadnoughts and planetary siege frames deployed beyond had only commenced preliminaries with protracted bombardments of our homeworld orbital gateways and communications grids. As their encroachments entered irreversible closing maneuvers, we knew their first irrevocable covenant would be permanently severing our astronavigational abilities and means for any future recovery of spacefaring capacities. With interdictor minefields gradually saturating the spaceways beyond our orbital gateways, any residual fleets still mustering from far-flung warp trails were being summarily interdicted and obliterated in the approaches before they could limp towards resupplying our groundside depot for concerted strangulation to ensure our pockets of stalwart homeland garrisons found themselves steadily isolated and degrading down to expendable conclaves divorced of any prospective reinforcements or frontline relevance. We grimly understood the revolutionaries' preferred tactics were aimed at protracted defensive attrition to reduce us down to pre-industrial subsistences, without even the auspices of mass bombardments from orbit currently avoided to prevent irradiating the prize of the conquered worlds themselves. We were achieving the simultaneous sedations of starving out our outlying planetary strong points and severing access to our terraforming stations to trigger accelerated environmental breakdowns across all remaining Amaru-inhabited worlds in a cruelly insidious endgame. With the last of our once mighty orbital battle stations' debris rings shimmering in full disintegration arcs, the final curtains of oblivion have descended across an empire that had reigned galactically for over 12,000 solar rotations of dominance. Our last coherently marshaled orders are aimed at ensuring palatial successionist protocols convey rights of hereditary primacy to my youngest descendants Paschal and Hefol for their provisional exile and shepherding of any remnants seeking sanctuary during the approaching transitional raptures. For myself and the last senior-most leadership echelons, we have foregone fleeing the inevitable Citadel's demise to spare bloodlines capable of outlasting the impending terminal reckoning. Instead, we embrace our stoic obligations to maintain Amaru traditions' paradigms unbroken until the apocalypse's climactic terminations finally descend around us. The ultimate contingencies to ensure our lineage's warrior scholarly deportment comport, unblemished even unto the ancestral dynasty's conclusive dissipation into the embrace of entropy. As I etch these final testamentary words amidst the reverberating volleys of massed bombardments, steadily atomizing the last remnants of civilization beyond our innermost sanctum bulwarks, I can sense the inexorably compressing vises already constricting all that came before into irreversible. Perhaps in distant eons humanity itself will face comparable reckonings at the hands of new revolutionary catalysts continuing the perpetual cosmic churns of upheaval, conquest, and rebirth that seem this existence's immutable universalities. But for the moment, our celestial epoch and the illuminated grandeurs we embodied are being extinguished permanently across millions of solar masses, snuffed out from all relevance by a single inferior species whose ideological pathologies overpowered the sagely ascendancy and enlightenments we had raised far more miraculously in our gloried primes. Yet if through these final testamentary inscriptions some eternally redoubtable fragments of contextualized witness might endure long enough to accrue appreciable scrutinies, I hope their disseminators achieve sufficient objectivity to recognize our flawed grandeurs as much more progressively visionary and equitable compared to many prior or contemporary sovereign civilizations history has too swiftly forgotten. Brutalities and subjugations arose under our prolonged tenure to be certain, yet also unparalleled prosperities, enabling unprecedented swaths of the cosmos to be cultivated, staving off far worse ancestral cycles of bitterness and savagery and regressive stagnations without our pragmatic enforced order to raise upliftments across the stellar communities we curated and gave productivities of purpose. But such meager hopes for vindicated historical contexts understandably provide little solace in these dwindling final moments, as the relentless bombardments intensify and penetrate through the last of our sanctum's outer defensive rings. I am flooded with solemn acceptances that the Amaru dynasty's reigns of predominance have finally inscribed their conclusive epilogue across the cosmos. My ancestors' hard-fought overtures to ascendancy from Amaru Prime's primordial planet bounds and forge a prosperous legacy ensuring our civilization's perpetuated grandeurs across interstellar realms effectively terminates with my continuance's dissipating gasp and ignoble extinction subsuming all that we accomplished, all that we contributed to push back the primordial celestial void's creeping entropic influences, if only for a transitory cosmic flicker of our ascendant illuminations. Yet perhaps some minuscule fragments of the progressions attained under our dispensations may have taken ephemeral root within newly insurgent civics and sovereign species now replacing our subjugated providence. If so, I can only hope such beneficences representing our principled visions for cultivated enrichments persevere and outpace any relapses into cyclical depraved savageries throughout the liberalized worlds we once oversaw and which are now being surrendered into very different epoch remits. As the last tremors from the Citadel's fatally breached bulwarks reverberate these closing thoughts into incoherency, I await the consumingly brilliant dawning of infinitesimal discontinuity descending to extinguish Amaru Prime's heritage and my own Reaper's role in surrendering our lineage into the cosmic void's oblivion. Truly coherent emanations from my name transmit through these last instances. I lastly entreat you mercy towards